Picture this. You're forced from your home at gunpoint, given minutes to pack your entire life, then marched hundreds of miles through scorching deserts and freezing mountains with barely any food or water. Children dying in their mother's arms, elders collapsing from exhaustion, soldiers shooting anyone who falls behind. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of the Long Walk of the Navajo, one of America's darkest chapters that most people have never heard about. What happened between 1864 and 1868 wasn't just a relocation. It was systematic destruction of an entire way of life. Today, we're diving deep into this tragedy that changed the Navajo Nation forever. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this story needs to be told. But first, let me paint you a picture of what life was like before everything changed. Imagine vast mesas stretching endlessly under turquoise skies where the Navajo people had thrived for centuries. They called themselves the Dene, meaning the people, and they had built something beautiful in the harsh landscape of the Southwest. The Navajo weren't just surviving in this desert, they were thriving. They had developed intricate farming techniques, growing corn, beans and squash in seemingly impossible terrain. They raised sheep and goats, weaving some of the most beautiful textiles the world had ever seen. Their hogans dotted the landscape like permanent promises that this was home, that this would always be home. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. As American settlers pushed westward in the 1840s and 1850s, conflicts became inevitable. The Navajo found themselves caught between expanding American territory and their ancestral lands. Raids and counter-raids escalated tensions, with both sides claiming the other had started the violence. Enter Kit Carson, a name that still sends chills through Navajo families today. Carson wasn't just any soldier. He was a frontiersman with a reputation for getting things done, no matter how brutal the methods. In 1863, the U.S. military gave him an order that would echo through generations, force the Navajo off their lands and relocate them to a reservation called Bosque Redondo. Now here's what makes this story particularly heartbreaking. Carson didn't just come with guns blazing. He came with a strategy designed to break the Navajo spirit completely. His orders were clear. Destroy everything that made Navajo life possible. Burn the crops. Kill the livestock. Cut down the peach orchards that had taken decades to grow. Make it impossible for anyone to survive on the land. Picture the horror as Navajo families watched generations of work go up in smoke. Those peach trees weren't just food sources. They were living monuments to their ancestors' labor. The sheep weren't just livestock. They were the foundation of their entire economic and cultural system. Carson's forces systematically eliminated not just the means of survival, but the very identity of the Navajo people. The psychological warfare was devastating. When you destroy someone's ability to feed themselves, you're not just attacking their body, you're attacking their soul. The Navajo began to face an impossible choice: surrender and face the unknown, or watch their children starve. As winter approached in 1864, the surrenders began, but this wasn't a gentle gathering. This was forced removal at its most brutal. Families were given almost no time to prepare. Imagine trying to decide what parts of your entire life you could carry on your back. What would you take? What would you leave behind forever? The march itself, the Long Walk, began in the spring of 1864. Picture this: approximately 8,000 to 10,000 Navajo people, from infants to elders, forced to walk 300 to 450 miles depending on their starting point. That's like walking from New York City to Detroit, through some of the harshest terrain in North America, with minimal supplies and armed guards who had orders to shoot anyone who fell behind. Let me put this distance in perspective for you. The average person walks about 3 miles per hour on flat ground. These weren't flat grounds. These were desert washes, rocky hills, and mountain passes. At 3 miles per hour, walking 8 hours a day, it would take at least 2 weeks to cover the distance. But this wasn't a leisurely hike. This was a death march. The hardships began immediately. The U.S. military had made virtually no preparations for feeding or protecting this massive group of people. Imagine thousands of people, including pregnant women, small children, and elderly individuals, walking through scorching desert days and freezing desert nights with inadequate food, water, and shelter. The stories that survive from this time will break your heart. Pregnant women giving birth on the trail, then having to keep walking within hours. Children too weak to continue being carried by parents who were already at their breaking point. Elders who had survived decades in the harsh Southwest, finally succumbing to exhaustion and despair. But here's what makes these stories even more tragic. The Navajo had to watch their culture being stripped away with every mile. They passed sacred sites that were central to their spiritual beliefs, knowing they might never see them again. They left behind burial grounds where their ancestors rested, breaking spiritual connections that had endured for centuries. The guards showed little mercy. Anyone who couldn't keep up faced brutal consequences. The weak were often left behind to die. Some accounts describe soldiers shooting Navajo people who had collapsed from exhaustion, claiming they were trying to escape. The message was clear: keep walking or die. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Food was inadequate and sometimes spoiled. Disease spread rapidly through the massive group. Dysentery, pneumonia, and other illnesses claimed lives daily. The trail became marked not just by footprints, but by graves. Now, let's talk about who this impacted, because the scope of this tragedy extends far beyond numbers. This wasn't just about relocating people. This was about destroying entire family systems, cultural practices, and ways of life that had evolved over centuries. Children suffered perhaps the most. Imagine being 5, 6, 7 years old, forced to walk distances that would challenge healthy adults. Many children died on the walk itself. Others arrived at Bosque Redondo traumatized, malnourished, and separated from everything familiar. These children would grow up carrying the trauma of the long walk, passing it down to their own children and grandchildren. Women faced particular horrors. Pregnant women were forced to give birth under the most brutal conditions imaginable. New mothers had to keep walking while their bodies were still recovering from childbirth. Women who had been the keepers of traditional knowledge, weaving techniques, stories, songs, healing practices, found themselves struggling simply to survive. Elderly Navajo people, who in traditional culture were revered as wisdom keepers, faced perhaps the cruelest fate. After lives spent accumulating knowledge and contributing to their communities, they found themselves burdens on a death march. Many made the ultimate sacrifice, choosing to fall behind rather than slow down their families, knowing it meant certain death. The men, traditionally the protectors and providers, found themselves powerless to shield their families from suffering. Imagine being a Navajo father, watching your children cry from hunger and thirst, unable to do anything to help them. The psychological trauma of this powerlessness would echo through generations. But the long walk was just the beginning. The destination, Bosque Redondo, was essentially a concentration camp in the New Mexico desert. The government had promised the Navajo a new home, but what they found was a nightmare that would last 4 years. Bosque Redondo, also called Hueldi in Navajo, was a barren stretch of land along the Pecos River. The soil was alkaline and virtually impossible to farm. The water was brackish and often made people sick. The wood was scarce, making it difficult to build proper shelter or stay warm during the brutal winters. The government had promised to provide food and supplies, but these promises were broken almost immediately. Rations were inadequate and often spoiled. The Navajo, who had been self-sufficient for centuries, found themselves completely dependent on a government that seemed determined to let them starve. Disease ran rampant in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Smallpox, dysentery, and pneumonia killed hundreds. The Navajo burial practices, which were central to their spiritual beliefs, became nearly impossible to maintain. Even in death, their culture was being stripped away. But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. Because the Navajo people refused to be broken, even in this hell on earth, they found ways to maintain their identity, their language, their traditions. They told stories to keep their history alive. They sang traditional songs quietly at night. They taught their children the old ways, even when it seemed like those ways might die with them. The resistance wasn't just cultural, it was also practical. The Navajo quickly realized that the government's promises were lies and that they would have to save themselves. They began organizing, planning, and preparing for what would eventually become one of the most remarkable acts of collective resistance in American history. Leaders like Barbonchito emerged during this time. Barbonchito, whose name means little beard, became a voice for his people's suffering and a negotiator for their freedom. He and other Navajo leaders began a careful campaign to convince the U.S. government that the Bosque Redondo experiment was a failure. The evidence was overwhelming. The promised agricultural success had never materialized. The cost of maintaining the reservation was enormous. Disease and death rates were staggering. But most importantly, the Navajo had never stopped demanding to go home. In 1868, after 4 years of suffering, the U.S. government finally admitted what the Navajo had known all along. Bosque Redondo was uninhabitable. A treaty was negotiated that would allow the Navajo to return to a portion of their ancestral lands. But here's the thing about that treaty. It wasn't given out of kindness. It was recognition of failure and a practical decision based on cost and politics. The Navajo had proven that they could not be broken, that their connection to their homeland was stronger than any government policy. The journey home in 1868 was bittersweet. Of the thousands who had been forced to walk to Bosque Redondo, fewer returned. Some had died from disease and starvation. Others had escaped during the internment and hidden in remote canyons. Still others had been so traumatized that they couldn't face another long journey. But for those who made the walk home, it was a march of triumph as much as tragedy. They were returning to their sacred mountains, their ancestral grounds, their homeland. Yet they were returning to a world forever changed. Much of their traditional territory had been taken by settlers. Their livestock was gone. Their homes had been destroyed. The impact of the long walk extends far beyond those 4 terrible years. The trauma was passed down through generations in ways that we're only beginning to understand today. Families lost their traditional knowledge. Children grew up disconnected from their culture. Communities were scattered and struggled to rebuild. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Imagine the survivor's guilt of those who made it through when so many didn't. Imagine the trauma of children who witnessed unimaginable suffering. Imagine the grief of families torn apart, never to be reunited. But here's what's truly remarkable about this story. The Navajo people not only survived, they rebuilt. They took the trauma and turned it into strength. They used the memory of the long walk, not as a source of bitterness, but as a reminder of their resilience. Today, the Navajo Nation is the largest Native American reservation in the United States, covering portions of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. The population has not just recovered but grown tremendously. The Navajo language is still spoken by hundreds of thousands of people. Traditional arts, from weaving to silversmithing, continue to thrive. The long walk is remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the Dene people. Every year, commemorative walks are held to honor those who suffered and died. Schools teach the history to new generations. The story is told and retold, ensuring that this chapter of American history is never forgotten. This story matters today more than ever. It's a reminder of what happens when fear and prejudice drive policy. It's a lesson about the consequences of dehumanizing entire groups of people. It's a testament to the power of cultural identity and the resilience of the human spirit. The Long Walk of the Navajo wasn't just a historical event. It was a defining moment that shaped not just Navajo identity, but American identity. It's a story that demands to be remembered, honored, and learned from. Because when we understand the full truth of our history, we're better equipped to ensure that such tragedies never happen again. The Dene survived, they endured, they rebuilt, and their story continues to inspire people around the world who face their own struggles against impossible odds. That's the true legacy of the Long Walk. Not just the tragedy, but the triumph of a people who refuse to be broken.